Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Rock Harbor Church Prophecy Update for this week. As you know, it's our desire to bring the events that are happening in the world from a biblical perspective and also a prophetic perspective. So thanks for joining us today. What we want to talk about this week is the signing of the Abrahamic Accords that happened this last Wednesday at the White House. You might have seen this on the news and heard about it or read a story about it, but it's been a long development that's been happening, that's been building up into this point. And so we're going to look at this and analyze it from a biblical perspective and also a prophetic perspective today and kind of understand things from that perspective, because a lot of people are cheering about this, thinking this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and they're saying how this is great, how we're going to have peace in the Middle East. And really, the things that are happening about this is setting the stage for a lot of end-time events. And so let's take a look at that today. So as I mentioned, this last Wednesday at the White House, President Trump basically oversaw the signing of the Abrahamic Accords. Jared Kushner was behind a lot of this getting on the table and getting this together. And again, I don't think Jared Kushner knows a lot of prophecy, obviously doesn't know a lot of the Bible. I don't think he knows any of it, obviously, because doing a peace deal with other Arab nations, with Israel conceding land and accepting a two-state solution and whatnot, is totally unbiblical. So when I see that and I see the stipulations in the Accords and any peace process that Jared Kushner puts up, it's usually with Israel giving up land, two-state solution, and therefore violating the Abrahamic covenant and dividing the land, which is forbidden. So to me, even though I know he's Jewish, he probably doesn't know the Old Testament very well and definitely doesn't know prophecy. So they end up doing deals like this and peace treaties like this that are in total violation to the scriptures. And so anyway, the leaders there were from the United Arab Emirates. Baghrein joined in as well, and they were making a peace deal with Israel as the United States oversaw this. Here's a video. You can watch the signing. We'll take a couple minutes to watch the signing at the White House, and then I'll come back after this.
The President of the United States, the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, and His Highness, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of the United Arab Emirates, will sign a treaty of peace, diplomatic relations, and full normalization. They will each sign 3 copies, one in English, Hebrew, and Arabic. We kindly ask that all guests remain seated for the signing of the documents.
Can you be helpful here in telling me your name? Okay.
You do the same for me in Arabic.
I will.
So, which one is mine?
Thank you.
That one.
Just
26 years.
Can we flip them over or give it to them up?
So the Abrahamic Accords, which is funny that they're throwing in the name Abraham, because ironically, the Abrahamic covenant from the Bible that God made with Israel is being violated by this so-called Abrahamic Accord. Well, again, the world and everyone's lauding it to represent the first time in decades that any Arab country has given diplomatic recognition to the Jewish state. That's true. That's true. We haven't seen a lot of cooperation from the Arabs with Israel and these Arab countries and whatnot. So it is seen a somewhat of a peaceful negotiations. That's true. And they're basically going to be opening up each other's embassies in their respective countries, and they're opening flights into these different areas, tourism, trade links, and whatnot. And so there's that cooperation involved in the agreement. Well, they're also going to have defense ties going to be put in pretty quickly here. Possible sales of Israeli fighter jets to Gulf Arab nations, possibly. And then basically, in their minds, the deal strengthens the regional alliance against Iran. And it might well do that because Iran is the troublemaker in the Middle East. And so a lot of Arab nations like Saudi Arabia, Baghrein, United Arab Emirates do not want Iran flexing their muscles in the Middle East. So I get why they're joining up with Israel. Israel is very strong militarily. And again, it seems like they have a common enemy with Iran. Anyway, the United Arab Emirates will continue, though, extending its support to the Palestinian people, which they shouldn't do. Just like Trump removed aid to the Palestinian people because it wasn't getting to the people. It was going to the top echelon, and it wasn't flushing out to the people. So we stopped that aid. We didn't want to fund terrorist activities and whatnot, so I applaud Trump for doing that. But they're going to continue to give money to the Palestinian people. And please understand, that money is not going to get to the ground. It's going to just stop at the leadership of the Palestinians, and that's where it's always piling up at. The people on the ground never get the money. It's a war zone there because the fat cats are getting rich off this money and they never let it go out to the people. Anyway, the agreement that also supports a two-state solution between Israel and Palestine. And that's no good. That's unbiblical. And that's where you start dividing the land up, and you're not permitted to do that according to the Abrahamic covenant, according to the land covenant that God made with Israel. Also, Israel stated that it has frozen the Jordanian Valley claim for Judea and Samaria. The political term is the West Bank, but when you hear the word West Bank, it's not the West Bank, it's Judea and Samaria that belong to Israel. Well, basically, they were going to annex this back in July, but they put a freeze on that, and so now it's kind of in limbo right now. They want to do it eventually, but again, it just prevents Israel from taking their rightful land of Judea and Samaria. All that land that God spelled out is still Israel's today. It's no one else's. There is no West Bank. It's Judea and Samaria. Anyway, it's still on the agenda, but they put a freeze on it. Anyway, the Trump administration calls it a pathway to peace for the region. Well, again, that's debatable. It's a pathway of peace for the Arab nations that want to fight and protect themselves against Iran. I get that. But it's really not going to lend itself to peace with Israel, because if they're going to have a two-state solution and they're going to have a terroristic state called the Palestinian state that's run by Hamas and Fatah, Israel will not see peace. They will continue to be attacked. And anyway, if you don't use biblical principles, biblical rules in any peace negotiation, it's going to flop. And unfortunately, this is not a pathway to peace. It's setting up Israel for more problems, unfortunately. Anyway, we're going to look at this peace deal. I believe it's a bad deal because it keeps the land divided. So let's look at what the scriptures will say about something like this. Well, if you turn to Joel 3, verses 1 through 2, it says, "For behold, in those days and at that time," talking about the future time, talking about the end times, when I bring back the captives of Judah and Jerusalem, that happened in 1948, I will also gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. This is what we call the sheep and goat judgment in Matthew 25. This is after Messiah comes back in the second coming, sets up his throne, and then he goes into the sheep and goat judgment of who's going to enter the kingdom and who isn't. And he says, I will enter into judgment with them there. Where? In the valley of Jehoshaphat, right there outside the east side of the Temple Mount. On account of my people, my heritage Israel, whom they scattered among the nations. And notice what he says here. They have also divided my land. And again, Messiah will judge the nations for dividing Israel's land. Israel will get judged for dividing its own land. Because according to the Abrahamic promise, which comes out of that, the land covenant, are the promises to the land, that God gave the Jews the land, and it's still good today. So anytime anyone makes a peace deal, whether it's Israel and these other countries making peace deals, that violate the Abrahamic covenant, violate the land covenant, they're setting themselves up against God. And it's not going to go well. I wish some Christian in the White House who knows this would be able to tell Trump, don't do this. Don't make Israel divide up their land. Tell Jared Kushner to stop it. Because it ends up being a problem for even the United States or any country that divides Israel. If you, according to the Abrahamic covenant, if you curse Israel, you will be cursed. If you bless Israel, you will be blessed. Dividing up their land brings upon the country a cursing from God. And if you ever saw the book Eye to Eye, you can pick that up on Amazon or anywhere. And anyway, if you look at the book Eye to Eye, what you'll see is that every time the United States has done something to Israel to divide her land, something bad happens to the United States. Whether it's an economic issue, whether that's natural disasters, but that's part of the Abrahamic cursing. And the economy gets hurt or hit. And so I wish we as a country wouldn't have been behind dividing up Israel. But again, they did. Well, many people say that this lays the foundation for the Antichrist covenant of death with Israel in the future. I disagree with that because there's other things in the text of Scripture that indicate something different. I understand from one standpoint how there's similarities, there's a mindset that I see that's common among Israel that's going to lend themselves to making peace agreements like they did with the Abrahamic Accords and eventually with the Antichrist. And that mindset, if you ever go to Israel and you talk to the Israelis, they want peace. They just want peace. They want to be left alone. They're tired of fighting. And I get that. We all get that. But they're willing to, many times, give up land for peace, make compromises for peace. And I think with this Abrahamic Accord, they gave up things. They gave into a two-state solution. They put their annexation on hold for Judea and Samaria. And just the simple fact of a two-state solution, they gave up land for that. They are allowing another country to squat on their land. Well, that's unbiblical. And so the mindset that you see typically when you're on the ground in Israel is they just want peace. And I remember being in Israel about a year and a half ago and hearing that from them. And I was telling some people that were on the tour with me, I'm saying that mindset's going to eventually do a deal with the Antichrist. They want peace and security at all costs, and they will be willing eventually to sign that covenant of death according to Isaiah 28, and they will make a deal somewhat, so to speak, with the devil, with the Antichrist. So I agree that it's the same mindset, but I don't agree that it lays the foundation for the Antichrist covenant. Because a lot of people will say, well, see, Antichrist confirms a covenant with Israel, and he basically makes an existing one stronger. That's not what the Hebrew is saying. The Hebrew is saying is something totally different. Antichrist is not building upon another covenant, another promise. So I know a lot of people are going crazy right now saying, this is the foundation for the Antichrist covenant. This is what he's going to make stronger. No, it's not. It's not. And I'll show you right now how it's not. According to Isaiah 28, 14 through 15, Isaiah is going to call it the covenant of death, and he's going to give the reason for why Israel enters into a covenant with the Antichrist. He says, therefore, hear the word of the Lord, you scornful men who rule this people who are in Jerusalem. Now, that's talking about the Israeli leadership. So that Israeli leadership will eventually one day be scornful men, prideful men who think they know what they're doing. They're mockers, mockers to God, mockers to Scripture, and think they know what they're doing, and so they will cut a deal with the Antichrist. And so, as you can see, the leadership of Israel is eventually going to change to one of appeasement, to one of just seeking peace and security at all costs. And so that mindset's already there in the Knesset, in the leadership of Israel. It's building. Anyway, Isaiah continues on in verse 15. He says, because you have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with Sheol, we are in agreement. So this covenant they get into with the Antichrist, from God's perspective, is called the covenant of death, because it leads into Israel being attacked eventually by the Antichrist himself and killing 2/3 of Israel in the last half of the tribulation. And so it's a covenant of death. He's going to turn on them, betray them. Well, anyway, it continues on in Isaiah saying this, when the overflowing scourge passes through, it will not come to us. For we have made lies our refuge, and under falsehood we have hidden ourselves. So now you see the purpose and the reason for the covenant that Israel makes with the Antichrist. It's to prevent an overflowing scourge, basically a military invasion, that it won't come to them. And basically, they are going to make lies, which is the lie from the Antichrist, that he's going to protect them from the overflowing scourge, their refuge. So the lies from the Antichrist become their refuge. The Antichrist becomes their refuge. And under this falsehood, they believe that they have hidden themselves from a military invasion. What military invasion is it referring to? I don't know. But it's something that threatens Israel. And so Antichrist steps in to be their guardian, to give them that refuge, to protect them militarily. And so Israel cuts a deal with the devil and goes into it. So that's the reasoning behind it. Now, if you look at the Abrahamic Accords, or any Oslo Accords, Camp David, or anything that you go back to, those accords were not for those reasons. The Abrahamic Accords today are not for protecting Israel from a military invasion. It's to have peace with Baghrein, maybe Saudi Arabia eventually, and other countries that are going to come into this coalition and basically work through economic ties and different things. So the Abrahamic Accords are not for what Isaiah says the covenant with Antichrist is for. It's totally different. It's for protection because of a military invasion. And that's not what the Abrahamic Accords are about. So in Daniel 9:27, where it talks about the Antichrist and the covenant he makes with Israel, I want to unpack that a little bit. It says in Daniel 9:27, then he, the Antichrist, shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined. So let's go back to the first part of the verse that talks about he will confirm a covenant. So the word in Hebrew is hikbir, okay? So a lot of people say, see, it says he's confirming an existing covenant. He's making an existing covenant stronger. That is not what the Hebrew is saying, according to Daniel 9:27. It does not, hikbir does not mean to renew an existing covenant. But what it means is to make an original one with strong promises. Obviously, the root word of hikbir is gabar. And the root word has the idea of to be strong, okay? To triumph over or to prevail. Thus picturing in this passage superior strength over someone or something. So the language hikbir from gabar, be strong, does not signify confirmation of a covenant, but a causation of a firm covenant. Again, it's not a confirmation of an existing covenant, it's the causation of a firm covenant. And so, a better translation should be that the Antichrist causes to prevail this covenant. It's the idea that Israel makes a covenant with a superior, and the superior has superior strength in the relationship, if that makes sense. So the Antichrist is the superior in the covenant. Israel's the inferior, the lesser. And he's superior because he has superior strength. And Israel is coming under that strength for protection, is what the Hebrew is trying to say. So this is an entirely new covenant for Israel's protection because they want his superior power. Okay, so that's really what the Hebrew is trying to say. Now, if you look at other scholars like Kill and Delitzsch, they note that in the confirming of a covenant, the two contracting parties are not viewed as standing on an equality, but he who concludes or who confirms the covenant prevails and imposes or forces the covenant on the other party. Charles Ray of Dallas Theological Seminary and Tyndale Seminary states, the first two Hebrew words are literally, shall cause a covenant to be strong, whose root can mean prevail, have strength, be great, have stability, make firm. The potency of this wording may imply the Jews are forced to accept the agreement because of the Antichrist's superior power. And I think he's right on that. I agree with what these scholars are saying. So basically the thought is this, that the Antichrist will impose on the many, not all, the many of Israel, the leadership of Israel, a strong covenant that they should make a covenant with him for security. So it's not so much an equal covenant where someone gives something, and vice versa. This is a top-down covenant on Israel. And Israel is in some type of position where they need his protection. The Abrahamic Accords are not saying that. This is kind of for mutual interest, these other accords, Oslo, Camp David, Abrahamic, whatever you want to call those things, they're equal. This is not. And that's why you cannot say this lays the foundation for it. Does it have the same mindset? Yes, but it's totally different. It's a brand new one. And it's enforced by the strength of the Antichrist. So one might ask, well, where does this fit into the prophetic scenario? Well, there is another scenario that I want to talk about that it does fit into. So it doesn't fit necessarily to the covenant of Antichrist with the Jews, as I've shown, but it does fit into the Gog of Magog invasion, talked about by the prophet Ezekiel in 38 and 39. And I want to talk about that. So as you know, you've probably heard there's going to be an invasion from a non-Arab invasion led by Russia. It's going to include Iran. It's going to include Libya. It's going to include Sudan. And it's going to include Turkey. There are 5 players. So basically, when you read Ezekiel, again, this is a non-Arab alliance that doesn't border Israel. It'll talk about the land of Magog, Rosh, Meshach, Tubal, and that's Russia. That's the area of Russia, southern Russia, really. Then it talks about Persia. That's easy. That's Iran. It talks about Gomer and Togarmah. That's Turkey. And it talks about Ethiopia, and basically that's modern-day Sudan. It talks about Libya, and Libya is Libya. And basically, Ezekiel mentions that there's others who watch the invasion and take a position of neutrality. They basically become onlookers. They question the invasion, but they don't get involved in it. So they might be friendly to Israel, but they're not going to help protect Israel at that time. Well, Ezekiel 38:13 says this and explains it. It says, Sheba, Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, and all her young lions will say to you, have you come to take plunder? Have you gathered your army to take booty? To carry away silver and gold, to take away livestock and goods, to take great plunder? So let's unpack that. So here are the neutral parties. They might be allies of Israel, but they don't protect. They're the onlookers, and Ezekiel mentions the onlookers. Now let's first start with the merchants of Tarshish and her young lions, and their young lions. Well, the merchants of Tarshish are basically Western Europe, Spain, and different parts of Western Europe would be in that general area in Europe. And then it refers to the young lions. The young lions would be countries that are birthed out of Tarshish, birthed out from Western Europe. Well, that's Canada, that's Mexico, that's the United States, that's South America, Central America. All the countries that came out of Western Europe were one of those countries. So if you ever want to find where could the United States be in prophecy, well, it possibly could be that we are one of the young lions. And I think that's a good interpretation. And if that's the case, basically the United States doesn't get involved in this attack. They stay neutral. We might be friends with Israel or allies, but we don't get involved. But the other one I want to mention, and this brings us to this Abrahamic Accord thing, is Sheba and Dedan. Sheba and Dedan are mentioned specifically in Ezekiel 38:13. And I want to walk us through that a little bit. Sheba and Dedan are Saudi Arabia, basically, today. And you can see on this map that I have where Sheba and Dedan are. And Sheba and Dedan would not only be Saudi Arabia, but it would include United Arab Emirates, and it would include Baghrein. So we're starting to see now with these other countries coming on board, and then also Saudi Arabia getting friendly with Israel, is that I believe we are watching the stage set for the Sheba and Dedan alliance that basically will eventually become neutral. And so these Abrahamic Accords are linking Israel with these friendly countries, these friendly Arab countries, even though they're Muslim. But in the end, these people they're allying with and making accords with will not come to Israel's rescue. They will let Israel be attacked. But again, it's setting that stage. So Israel's getting in line, and of course, Sheba and Dedan won't attack because they've done a covenant with Israel. They've done an Abrahamic Accord, so to speak, if that's the thing. And basically, they'll stay neutral. They won't attack. Or they will not intervene to protect Israel. And so will the United States. And again, folks, you have to understand our position as the United States. Most people now don't want to get involved in a Middle East skirmish anymore. They're tired, they're worn out. They see that these wars continue to go on and on and on. And we don't know what the future holds for us with defending Israel. I would say right now we will. But in the future, if something changes or whatever, you can see America backing off from getting involved in a war in the Middle East. even though Israel is our ally. Those trends are going in that direction. So these players that Ezekiel names are lining up. And that's what I would say with the Abrahamic Accords, where that leads into for the future, for prophecy. You might ask this question, when will it take place? Well, I believe that the invasion of Gog of Magog is a pre-tribulational event. It happens prior to the tribulation. And I have two reasons for this. And again, this is debatable. I'm not going to be dogmatic about it, but I think the evidence lends itself to a pre-tribulational event, and I'll explain why. There's basically two reasons why I believe this. The first thing has to do with the Hebrew word betak. And then the second thing has to do with the 7 years of Israel gathering and burning weapons of the enemies of that invasion that Ezekiel talks about. So let's first talk about the Hebrew word betak. And this is in Ezekiel 38, 10 through 12. It says this, "Thus says the Lord God, on that day it shall come to pass that thoughts will arise in your mind, and you will make an evil plan. You will say," talking about Israel's enemies, "I will go up against a land of unwalled villages, to go to a peaceful people who dwell safely." And that's the key word I want to hit on. That's where we get the Hebrew word betak. Dwell safely. Dwelling safely has the idea of being militarily secure. That's what betak means. And then it continues on, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates, because of this betak, this military security, right? And then it goes on in verse 12, to take plunder, to take booty, to stretch out your hand against the waste places that are again inhabited. So again, Israel is inhabited now by the Jews, so that's been satisfied. And against a people gathered from the nations, that's been satisfied, who have acquired livestock and goods, who dwell in the midst of the land, which has been satisfied. And so I believe that the betak that Ezekiel's talking about has been satisfied, along with the other things that Ezekiel says. It's ready, it can happen. And again, if you look at Israel, Israel is militarily secure. And again, the idea is that Israel as a nation has become military secure. They are one of the top militaries in the world. And because of that, Israel, the land of Israel, has become a refuge of the Jews. And so that's why we've seen streams of Jews leave Europe because of the anti-Semitism there and stream back into Israel. And now we're watching in the United States as anti-Semitism builds from these crazy Marxist Antifa communists who hate Jews and the false religions of our world who hate the Jews. You're starting to see a flow of Jews back into Israel from the United States because they're seeing Israel as military secure and a place of refuge. So Ezekiel is being satisfied even as we speak. So prophecy teachers like Joel Rosenberg, Dr. Ron Rhodes, Dr. Tommy Ice, and Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum believe that present conditions in Israel fulfill the spirit of Ezekiel's prophecy. And so I'm not alone in my position. There are other biblical scholars that believe this as well. They also believe that the word betak is being military secure. And that's basically Israel's confidence in themselves, in their own military strength. So they all agree with that. So they, as well as I do, believe that this is a good description of Israel today. You got to remember that Israel's fought 4 major wars since its founding in 1948. And guess what? They routed their enemies. They won them each time, handily. And basically today, Israel is a major threat militarily to these nations who would ever think about invading them or trying to attack them. They know Israel can throttle them. And so that's why they do unconventional warfare tunnels and blowing themselves up and kind of doing terroristic tactics, which are unconventional, because if you tried to have a full-out war with them, they know Israel will smoke them. It's not even going to be a problem for Israel. So this is a different security that Ezekiel's talking about than the one that Israel gains from the Antichrist. This is their own military making them secure, versus when the Antichrist makes a deal with them, they're coming under the protection of Antichrist military security. So it's different. So as Dr. Ron Rhodes states, he says this, quote, "This sense of security does not depend on the Antichrist signing of the covenant with Israel. Seen in this light, the invasion of the Northern Military Coalition could take place at any time before the tribulation period begins." He goes on to say, "My assessment is that Israel is already in the state of relative security, and that the invasion will likely take place sometime after the rapture, but before the beginning of the tribulation period." Dr. Tommy Ice also agrees and suggests that the invasion, quote, "will be during the interval of days, weeks, months, or years between the rapture and the start of the 7-year tribulation." I would also add that I agree with Dr. Fruchtenbaum in the sense that since the rapture is imminent, it can happen at any time, we are only promised to be raptured prior to the tribulation. So, as these scholars agree that the Gog of Magog invasion is a pre-tribulational event, I believe, along with Dr. Fruchtenbaum, that it doesn't necessitate that a rapture happens before it. The rapture only needs to happen before the tribulation. So it's very possible that we could see the Gog of Magog invasion since it's a pre-tribulational event. And again, we're only promised to be raptured prior to the tribulation. Are we going to see some pre-tribulational events? It's very possible, and this could be one event. Or we could be raptured and it happens afterwards, like Dr. Ron Rhodes says. But we all understand that there's an interval that needs to happen with this event prior to the tribulation. We all understand that there needs to be some time, because if you continue to read Ezekiel and you go to Ezekiel 39, there's a timing element involved in this that makes it hard to put it inside the tribulation. So let's look at Ezekiel 39, verse 9. It says this, "Then those who dwell in the cities of Israel will go out and set on fire and burn the weapons, both the shields and the bucklers, the bows and arrows, the javelins and the spears, and they will make fires with them for 7 years." So note that passage. It's saying that after the invasion, Israel is doing a cleanup. They're cleaning up all the weapons. They're gathering the weapons and burning them. Okay, but how long do they burn them? Well, in that last phrase, they will make fires with them for 7 years. There's your timing element. This is why I, along with other scholars that study prophecy, believe this is a pre-tribulational event because of the 7-year period that is required to clean up the weapons. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, for instance, if you have this in the tribulation period, we all know that maybe for 3.5 years, everything's peaceful in Israel because the Antichrist is protecting them. But you and I know at the 3.5-year mark, Antichrist turns on them and decides to wipe Israel out and destroy them as a nation. Well, I don't think at that point in time, just logically speaking, that Israel will worry about cleaning up weapons and burning them, because they're going to be running from the Antichrist, and a remnant will go out to Petra, and the other remnant will stay in Jerusalem, and they're under attack the whole last half of the tribulation. So when you look at the 7 years, they have to have 7 years to do this cleanup. You can't fit that in the tribulation. It just doesn't work if Israel's on the run from the Antichrist. So prophecy scholars like Dr. Ron Rhodes says this, quote, "If the invasion takes place after the rapture, and the rapture takes place at least 3.5 years prior to the beginning of the tribulation period, the weapons used in the invasion could be completely burned for 7 years prior to the midpoint of the tribulation when Israel takes flight from Jerusalem. And then that's seen in Matthew 24, 15 through 21. He goes, therefore, a significant lapse of time may separate the rapture from the beginning of the tribulation. And so his point there is, you got to have 7 years. And he says, I can push this basically into the tribulation for at least the first 3.5 years of the tribulation, but I can't push it past that. So he's saying there's got to be at least 3.5 years prior to the tribulation starting, and then 3.5 years to the midpoint, so you got your 7 years. Again, that's one view. The other view is you could have a gap of 10 years. You could have a gap of 20 years. You don't know. So you at least have to have a gap of at least 3.5 years prior to the tribulation. But I believe you can extend it out more as a possible scenario. You don't have to have this going into the tribulation. You can have the entire 7-year cleanup prior to the tribulation. And that's a possibility as well. So if the rapture happens before the Gog of Magog invasion, you would still have 7-year gap between that time and the tribulation starting. We all assume that there's going to be some type of gap. The other scenario is if you extend it out, okay, you got your 7 years of the Gog Magog cleanup, you can extend it even further and say somehow it even happens prior to the rapture, because there is no sign event for the rapture. It only happens before the tribulation. So you could have the Gog of Magog invasion, and we could see that. We could be raptured right after that, or we could be raptured after the 7 years of burning and still be within that time frame of the gap before the tribulation starts. I know sometimes it's hard to confuse people, but people have simplified things too much, and it confuses people. Because most people think that the rapture happens and then the tribulation starts. The rapture does not start the tribulation. The peace agreement with Israel from the antichrist is what starts the tribulation. We are only promised to be raptured prior to that. So we could see a lot of setup. We could possibly see the Gog and Magog invasion. We could possibly not. But you have to open yourselves up to the idea that it's possible to see that, and it's possible we can't see it. So it just depends on the timing of when the Lord raptures us and prior to the tribulation. So the longer we're here, the more we're going to see. If he raptures us tonight, we won't see anything. But again, the longer he tarries, the longer he delays, we can see a lot more. So basically what we're trying to do is analyze the Abrahamic Accords. We said that it doesn't apply necessarily to the covenant that Antichrist is going to make. We do see the same mindset in the Israeli mind about peace at all costs type of thing, which is going to eventually get them in trouble. But we said, though, this fits better with the players of the Gog of Magog invasion, and particularly the Sheba and Dedan coalition that just sits it out. And I think that's what we're starting to see. There's more pieces of the puzzle being put in place for the Gog of Magog invasion. So we want to keep our eye on the Middle East, focus in on what's happening there, because things are coming to a head. It's going to reach a tipping point, and then that invasion will one day happen. And God bless you guys for tuning in. We appreciate all the prayers and support. And remember what Jesus said. When you see these things begin to happen, look up, lift up your heads, because your redemption draws near. God bless you. We'll see you next time.